Hello, everyone. Since today's guest is European, I thought it would be appropriate to have a slight mistranslation of a sign in a Bucharest hotel, which said very simply in English, the lift, meaning the elevator, the lift is being fixed. During this time, you will be unbearable. Today's guest is Kim-Adele Randall. London-based Kim-Adele Randall is a business consultant, international best-selling author, inspirational keynote, TEDx speaker, and proud mother. Over 25 years of experience in the corporate world, she has developed the skills to empower others to achieve sustainable transformation for professional and business success. As a testament to her expertise, her upcoming book is called Authentic Achievements, with a very long subtitle, The 7 Secrets of Building Brave Belief, Unstoppable Sales, and Turning Your Leaders into Talent Magnets for Guaranteed Sustainable Growth. Welcome, Kim. Delighted you're with us today.
Oh, Philip, thank you so much for having me. And my apologies for the ridiculously long subtitle to the book.
As long as it fits on the cover, that's fine. It's between you and the publisher.
It's really small print.
That's one way to do it. Very good. So let's start by you giving us a bit of background about how you evolved into your current role in the leadership training field. One doesn't normally wake up in the mornings or have an aspiration as a child thinking this is what I'd like to do. It's something that normally evolves.
And no, you're so right. And if I were to go back to being childhood and what I wanted to do, all I wanted to be was a hairdresser. And I was very fortunate. I left school at 15 and I lived my dream. I became a hairdresser. I set my own business up at 18. And I was like, this is it. So I hit the big time. This is where I'm going. And then unfortunately, I had an illness at 24 where I became severely allergic to perm lotion, which in the 90s was a challenge as a hairdresser. Because it was big stuff back then. So I sold my business. In fact, the girl I sold it to still runs it today, which is great. She worked for me at the time. And I got a temporary contract at a bank while I worked out what on earth to do now, because that would have been my dream, my career path. And that led me into the next 30 years of building a career, mainly in financial services, but I moved around also into IT, software and technology, and moved myself up to board level roles, and was loving doing all of those. And then I became a mum late in life, and I realized at that point I needed to think differently. So I could no longer be the big CEO of £150 million company and be a good mum, because I was a single mum. So I had to make some different choices. So at that point, I decided, well, I've done this for years. For years, I've gone into organizations and done transformational change. How do you take them when they're stagnating and get them to break through that next level and really turn around that culture? And I was like, well, I could do that for another company, or I could do it for lots of people by setting up my own business and consulting on that basis. And that was about 5.5 years ago. And since then, I've been really fortunate. My world's kind of evolved a little bit, as you mentioned. I'm a best-selling author now, which happened on was actually day one of lockdown. So on day one of lockdown, somebody got in touch and said, Kim, we're writing a book about remote working, and you've led remote teams for years. Would you write something in the book? And I was like, no, I can't even write a shopping list. I certainly can't write a chapter of a book. And they were like, no, go on, do it for us. And there was an extra challenge, which was you've got 5 days to write your chapter. But I looked at it and I was like, I'm locked in a house on my own with a 2.5-year-old who, funnily enough, sleeps a lot because she's 2.5. So I've got no excuse, really. So I did it. And on day 10 of lockdown, we published. And on day 12, we became international best-selling authors. And I ended up on like local and national radio talking about it, thinking, this is surreal. We're in lockdown. I've suddenly pivoted into something else, and that was the start of doing. I'm now on my, I've just published my 6th book. I'm writing my 7th, which, as you know, has got a ridiculously long subtitle. And I got into public speaking. I was really blessed to do a TEDx last year. And I think for me, it's been more around, we're moving into a world of knowledge being really important, and people can get that knowledge. It took me 30 odd years to get my knowledge. So other people can get it, and it might not take them the same 30 years it took me. I might be a slow start. But what the difference is, I can tell them the key lessons that I've learned over those 30 years. So you don't have to go through the mistakes. You don't have to go through the pitfalls. Here are the things that I've seen time and time and time again help you to build strong cultures, to attract great talent, to drive unstoppable sales, to turn your business into something that's not just scalable, but saleable. And for me, that's kind of my purpose, I think.
Absolutely. It makes perfect sense. You mentioned about the 7 secrets of unstoppable sales. Could you, without divulging too many details, because of course you want people to buy the book, perhaps you could share with us some examples of what these secrets are.
So I think one of the first ones, I was talking to an old colleague earlier today from an organization that I worked with internationally. And one of the first challenges is, you go into most businesses, and when they start talking about things, they talk about what they need. So they talk about what it is that they're providing, because they believe in what it is that they're doing. And I remember standing up, and I was head of sales for a big international multi-million-pound organization at the time. And I remember my boss's face at the point I stood up in front of this conference and said, the first thing you need to know is nobody actually wants our product. And you could see him sitting there going, oh my gosh, she's head of sales, get her off, what's she doing? She's like, she's killing us. And I went, you need to understand, nobody wants it, they need it. I said, and the reason I say that is, we're an accounting software organization. So nobody, unless they're an accountant, went into business because they wanted to do accounts. They need to do accounts. So you can't try and create a want in them. There's no point trying to pretend you're the next Apple, because they're just not interested. What they're interested in is, how do you help them achieve the necessity of their accounts in the least amount of time, so that they're not distracted from their business. I said, but if you're in the wants business, then you need to react differently. And that was probably one of my key lessons and key secrets, is understand first, are you want or need? So if I was to give you a different a kind of example, if I want a pen because I want to write something down, any old pen will do. Like, any pen you can give me, it's going to allow me to write stuff down. I'm there. That's exactly what I need, because I've got a need for that. If I want a Mont Blanc, it's because I want the prestige that comes with it. I want the feeling that goes around that. I want to have the elite status that comes with it. So you can't sell me a Mont Blanc in the same way you can sell me an everyday biro. And you have to first understand, as an organization, which part are you playing in? Are you want or are you need? And from there, you can craft your brand, your strategy, and your communication. And it makes a significant difference. And across the years, that's where I've seen the biggest disconnect in organizations, is they don't know that key element for themselves first.
Yes, you mentioned some words that our listeners and viewers might not know, because they are somewhat European. First of all, previously, but when Brits talk about mum, they mean mom or mother in American English. So just it's not necessarily the champagne mum. It means mother.
I work with a lot of, and I have to constantly correct myself. I've just been writing some stuff for a colleague and I write obviously in English, and they giggle at me all the time. Because it is Queen's English, and they'll go, "How have you spelled favourite, Kim?" And I was like, "That's how you spell it." It's like, "Oh, it's not how you spell it." Sorry, let me change that because they don't always translate. So we say mum as in M-U-M, but American, I know it's mom as in M-O-M. So it's just, again, trying to always be conscious of thinking about how does this land with the person that you're trying to communicate with versus how does it land for you?
Exactly. And the two pen brand names you mentioned, Mont Blanc, that's a Swiss
Yes.
white mountain, actually. And did you say Byron? What was the other one?
So Byron, so over here it would be Bic, which is another brand's name. Yes. I wasn't certain if Bic or Byron was more translatable.
Right. Very good. Makes sense. What are some of the companies that you've actually grown by applying some of these principles?
So I've worked for quite a few. I've worked for some of the big ones, but in my industry, some of the big ones. So like Sage, Iris. I worked for Capital One. I worked for Barclays Bank, for Royal Bank of Scotland and NatWest, for Lloyds Banking Group. So in the main, I spent a large part of my time in that financial services and IT software space, mainly in technology. Since moving on my own, I've worked with probably slightly smaller organizations, normally between sort of like 20 and 50 million dollar turnover in the US. I've worked with those globally, whereas kind of the bigger ones were the likes of sort of Barclays and Sage.
And are you able to give to us perhaps how much you grew their sales in terms of revenue or percentages?
Yeah, so probably one of my biggies was Sage. So when I first went into them, they'd got stagnated growth. So I went in and we took them from stagnated growth to double-digit growth. We then did 4 consecutive quarters of double-digit growth. We grew them from that one section that I looked after, grew from 100 million to 175 million in the period that I was there. And that's pounds, because that was at the time that was a UK based piece. If I think about some of the ones from a dollars point of view, it was probably going to be Capital One was probably my best example. And there, the organization, they were at $200 million for the section that we looked after. And we were able to take that to $300 million by really digging into what was happening in the organization. And for me, it's about both levels. So very often I see people talk about growing the revenue, but actually it's growing your bottom line. So sometimes you want to grow more sales, but sometimes there's sales you want to say, I don't want any more of those because they actually cost me money. So it's understanding kind of which ones absolutely have an impact on your bottom line, because that's the piece that really is important to an organization.
Absolutely. And what other principles you mentioned to distinguish between needs versus wants, or to distinguish whether your product or service is a true necessity or something simply desirable? What are some of the other principles that you mentioned, you talk about?
So I think one for me of the most important ones is what we can do as a leader. So people in their base want to be listened to, understood, and respected. And I believe that to be true of every human being on the planet. That doesn't mean to say we can never disagree, but we never disrespect. So when we really start to understand what's important to our people, and what are they trying to do? And I use the analogy again of being a hairdresser. So when I was hairdressing, they taught me that what I had to do was listen to understand what was really important to that person, to help them to try and achieve it, and to have them leave you feeling the best version of themselves. And in my opinion, that's leadership. If we can do that for every single person that works for us, I promise you they will walk through fire for you, because they know that you care and that you're interested, and that, I think it was Steve Jobs that said, don't don't recruit people and then tell them how to do it, what to do, and when to do it, because you could train a monkey to do that, and bring them in because you think that they're going to be able to inspire the organization to move forward. So we have to set boundaries, but we need to move away from micromanaging and allow people to like step into their full potential. And I think once I've, in the organizations where I've done that and where I've been confident to say, do you know what, you know this better than I do. I don't have to know this. If I knew how to do every one of your jobs better than you did, I don't need you.
Right.
I don't need you. That's not a great place to be. So prove me wrong. Show me how much I need you. Show me the value you add. Show me the uniqueness of you, because that's going to be, as an organization, how we really grow. But that takes an ability as a leader to be vulnerable, to be able to say, I don't know. And it's okay to not know. And that's probably one of the biggest lessons that I learned. I remember having a boss many years ago who said, the bit I love about you, Kim, is you don't have a personal agenda. And I always used to joke, I'm not bright enough for a personal agenda. I can only deal with one agenda. So I'm going to go with the one you're paying me for. And if I get that one right, then you'll think well of me, and therefore my ego will be okay, because you won't think I'm hopeless. And he said, but what I is it literally was the goal that you were given was the one that was the most important, and getting there in the best way. And I think we often, and I see this in organizations all over the place, we derail ourselves and we derail the organizations that we're working in because we get too wedded to being right, rather than being wedded to the right thing being done. And I think once we learn that shift, where for me it's more important that the right thing gets done, and if I don't get the recognition for that, I really don't mind, because over time people will spot that the right thing gets done wherever you turn up. Where I've seen it go wrong is in those organizations where people want to go, but that was because of me, I did that, and they're so big on getting that recognition that actually it gets lost in translation, particularly, and I know we're talking today about international challenges. That gets lost in translation very quickly when we talk about the different cultures, because different cultures view those things in a very different way.
And I'd like to explore that more. One of the aspects that you were talking about is the leader should admit what he or she doesn't know. And I'm just thinking, in many societies in Latin America, in the Middle East, in Africa, and Asia, I'm not sure the leader can admit that readily, because the leader is considered not only the figurehead, but the font of all wisdom and knowledge. And how does that work?
It's so true. And I think it's not about admitting per se, I don't know how to do that, but it's admitting that as the most wise leader, and as most wise leaders across the globe in all cultures, what they're able to do is engage the experts because they're wise. So instead of admitting defeat, what they do is they encourage a culture of engaging the experts, where they go, I know all of these things, but because I know all of these at a high level, what I really want to do is have my expert at hand that knows the depth of this one, that can like really get down to the nitty gritty. So I'm not suggesting I'm vulnerable per se as a leader, but I am acknowledging my ability to bring the best advisors, the best support in to build on my knowledge because I'm wise. So it's all about how we position it. But it's having to admit, at least internally, that you can't know everything. So how best do you ensure that you have all of that knowledge at your fingertips in a way where you still feel that your position has not been undermined?
What other cultural issues arise through this method or others, where there might be cultural disconnects, for example?
Oh, they can be so many. I mean, we were chatting before we came on, weren't we? About, I've got some people that I was dealing with, and they were dealing with some Danish colleagues. Now, culturally in the UK, as an example, we're dreadfully bad at feedback. Dreadfully bad at it. It's like, if you get something wrong, we're going to tell you all about it. But if you get something right, at best, we'll go, good job. If you deal with people in the Danish culture, they're just going to be brutally honest, whatever. If it's good, they're going to tell you what it is. If it's bad, they're going to tell you what it is. In the UK, if we just talk about those two cultures, the minute someone's that direct with you, you go, they don't like me, they're going to get rid of me, this is really awful. And so we layer in all of these levels of it means something else. Whereas for the Danish person, they've told you what it was, and then they've gone on about their day. You know, it's like they're not giving it any more thought. It's not got this additional story that's coming with it. So I remember I was dealing with one. It was a guy that I was doing leadership coaching with, and every time I spoke to him, he'd be like, "Oh, Kim, and they've done this. You know, I'm on my last legs. They're going to have me out." And I said, "Have they said that to you?" Like, no. And I went, "They're Danish. I promise you. If they thought you were on the way out, you'd know, and not know from the subtle innuendos of what might be layered into the stories that they're telling you. You would know, because they would have sat in front of you and gone, if you do not change, you will be out. Full stop." Because culturally, that's appropriate for them. Culturally in the UK, we would go, "Oh, that's a bit harsh. Someone should sugar that pill, shouldn't they?" So I think there's so many nuances. So I think for me, one of the biggies about working internationally is that you have to take a globalized strategy to it. So although you're working globally, you've got to engage locally. So you've got to understand what's going on in that individual culture. How does that fit? How does that manifest? And I know we were chatting earlier. I think we both had a very similar story, didn't we? I worked for Capital One, and I had a colleague that had joined us from America who very nearly got into a fight because somebody invited him out for a cigarette break, which if they'd said cigarette break would probably have been okay. But in the UK, we'd say, do you want to go for a fag? And that has a very massively different connotation. So it caused huge problems in something that was so seemingly innocent, in that they were trying to engage and make him feel welcome, and inadvertently made him feel hugely offended and massively unwelcome.
You say also that you turn leaders into talent magnets for guaranteed and sustainable growth. What methods do you use for that? Are they similar leadership qualities, or are there some others instead?
So similar leadership qualities, but also the art of really learning to listen, to understand, not to interject. So unfortunately, listening is an art form that we've lost the ability to be part of. So all too often in conversations, we listen to interject, we listen to give our point of view, to tell them what we think, and therefore we're not really listening anymore. So when we instead listen to understand, and one of the things that I encourage people to do is swap judgment for curiosity. So the way our brains are wired is they're wired to make judgment because they needed to. You know, we used to have to work out if we were about to be eaten or not. So you kind of wanted to make a bit of a snap decision there. Likelihood is now we're less likely to be at risk of being eaten every time we step out of the door. So we probably have got a bit more time. But we really need to think. So one of the things I do it for myself, I do it with colleagues, is our brain will automatically snap to judgment. We'll do it all the time. Somebody says something, can you go, I agree with that, I don't agree with that. That's interesting, that's not interesting. The point of swapping judgment for curiosity is to just get passionately curious. So when somebody tells you something that you go, I don't agree with that, instead of going, I don't agree with that, go, okay, that's really interesting. I've never come to that conclusion. I've never considered it in that way. Would you mind giving me some more insight into how you got there? You may still end up disagreeing, but you'll be amazed at what you learn on the journey. And likewise for yourself, when you go, I don't agree with that, be curious with yourself. Okay, so that's interesting. Why am I so adamant that that's wrong?
Mm.
What is it that tells me? So it's just swapping all of those statements and turning them into questions, a bit like children do. There's an old methodology that's called the 5 why methodology, and it talks about the fact that the first thing that we say is the thing that we think is most likely to be accepted.
Mm.
So it's not necessarily the truth. It is true, but it's and you'll see this a lot when people say they're leaving a job, and you go, "Oh, why is that?" It's the money. Oh, okay, but if you start asking them questions around, what about the money? Is it? What else is it that comes to that? By the time you get to the 5th layer, you'll actually get to the crux of the problem. You'll get to the piece that really needs fixing. And while I don't advocate that everybody turns into toddlers and starts going, why, because it's just being more curious. And for me personally, I try and not use the why term in any questions, because again, culturally, in certain cultures, it brings with it a layer of judgment. The fact that you're asking why brings across a feeling that you are judging their previous answer as being incorrect. Not in all cultures, but in some. So instead, asking more open questions that goes, oh, okay, that's really interesting. What is it that makes that so important? How is it that manifests? So just remove just the word why from my experience, in a lot of cultures, you can suddenly end up in an argument with somebody that you don't understand where you got there. And it's because you use the term why, which makes them think that you are almost automatically saying, I disagree. And now I'm going to ask you to justify your point. So again, learning those different questioning techniques can be really useful internationally.
Yeah, I learned not to say why from a therapist, because when you ask someone why, it can sound very accusatory.
Yeah.
And therefore it's not an equal conversation. It's I'm right, you're wrong, and so forth.
Yeah.
So instead, as you say, to rephrase the questions, what causes you to think that, or how did you come to that conclusion, or how did this evolve for you, so forth.
Yeah.
Very, very useful in that way. How do your methods apply to other nationalities? Are these universal, or do you find that some nationalities are more receptive and others are not?
Great question, Philip. I think some nationalities find them easier to kind of take on board and try. For others, it's helping them find that comfortable space where they can operate, because being vulnerable, as you've already mentioned, in certain cultures is not acceptable. It's not the done thing. So it's how can we help them to find a space where they're able to, in reality, be vulnerable without demonstrating that vulnerability overtly. So that back to the I invite the experts in. So I'm wise enough to surround myself with the best, all of the, and be able to demonstrate that that's been being done in their culture all over the place. So for history and for decades. So I think some of it is in that nuancing, and I think it's being able to. So I always try and liken it to, if you've written a best-selling book, let's say it's a best-selling novel, because everyone will have a novel that they love. Not everyone will have a favorite business book. So we've got a best-selling novel that's been written, and that author wants it to be available worldwide. So it gets translated into different languages. But what often happens with those books is there'll be certain elements of the book that have to be translated, transcribed, changed slightly also to make it relevant to that culture. If not, the book's not going to be there. So although the main story doesn't change, although the main message doesn't change, the characters don't change, there'll be elements that get changed to make that readable, usable, enjoyable in that culture. And I think for me, that's the nugget of working internationally, is saying you've got these things that you know work wherever they go, but you've got to be able to translate them into achievable, actionable, enjoyable things that the culture within which you are working are going to be able to embrace.
Yes, and since translation is our field, among others, one of the mistakes that people commonly make is to assume that artificial intelligence, or what's called machine translation, will simply work. Many times it does, primarily in Spanish and French, but in many times it doesn't, especially in Asian languages, Asian cultures. And even though you can translate the words, as you say, they have to be culturally adapted to the situation or to the culture. And just, the very common one, if one refers to football to you in Britain means something very different than it does to me as an American. We would say soccer, you would say football, because obviously you invented the concept. So just those, very simple cultural adaptations, of course, must be considered, but the words as well, just to know that certain times translation does work well. And interestingly, especially when it's technical, it does work well because there are not a lot of differences in how one phrases something. But if you have common speech, like if I use the word spring in English, spring has at least 4 meanings: the season, to jump, a brook, and what's the other one? A coil in a mattress. Yes. So, that's an example of where common speech, and so mistranslations often happen in common speech, as you know.
But they do, and again, we were chatting, weren't we, before we came on here, and say you see these big differences when you're dealing internationally, but we'll all have had them ourselves dealing locally, and if we can have them dealing locally, they're just going to get magnified dealing internationally. So yeah, I think I shared one when I got my kind of first Saturday job, and I worked 25 miles away from where I lived, so really, really close, really close. And yet, what we used to call the bread that you'd put you'd make your sandwich or you put your fillings in was called a cob. 25 miles away, when I worked in the next city, a cob meant you were really upset. Somebody had really hurt you, that you needed to go and you were mad and angry and frustrated. You used to be somewhere else. So when I innocently said I'm going to the cob shop, meaning I was going to go and get my lunch, I was going to go and get my cheese sandwich, whatever it was, they were like, "Oh my God, Kim, what's happened? Who's hurt you?" And I was like, "Nobody, I'm hungry. It's lunchtime." And it was such a ridiculous thing, but we were so close. And I've seen this in organizations, where we're dreadful these days for acronyms. We use acronyms all the time, and businesses literally globally that I've worked at, they've all got their favorite acronyms, and you almost need a kind of like organization to English dictionary to work out what they're saying. But again, there was one organization that I was dealing with, they were financial services, and I was sat at a board meeting and they were having this massive debate, and I raised with them, I was like, I think the thing we need here is a few more TLAs. And everyone were like nodded away. Yeah, that's brilliant, Kim, great. Went, who's going to take that as an action? And somebody put their hand up and went, I don't know what it is. And thank you for being brave. I mean, 3-letter acronym, because you guys have spent 20 minutes talking about T's and C's. But for this half of the table, T's and C's means training and competence, because we're a regulated financial services organization. And therefore, we have to have that for the regulator. And they're all nodding, going, yeah. I said, but for you guys over here, you're meaning terms and conditions, which we also need to have for the regulator, but under a different banner. So you're making decisions about something that you don't understand the context within which you're making the decision. And I see that all the time. So I think for me, almost when you're dealing internationally, you're more cognizant of that, you're more aware of that, because you know that there's those language differences. For me, it's being cognizant of the ones where you have a pre-assumption that there'll be less of those, well, there'll be less of those areas where, so I deal a lot with America, which for you guys is not international. For me as a UK person is international, because different things that, so I went into an organization and was talking to them about what over here we would call your management information, your P&L, your key performance indicators, your reporting, your budgets, all the things you're going. We badge all of that as management information, and we call it MI. That's our little analogy. I may as well have been talking Swahili. Everybody I spoke to would just be sitting there going, what are you talking about? Does anybody know what she's saying? Like a crazy English woman that's kind of coming and saying all of these things. So it's recognizing that sometimes you put more effort into thinking, I'm about to speak to a Middle East country or an Asian country or a South American country or a European country. So I'm going to really think about the culture. Where we often get tripped up is those countries that we go, well, they're the same as us, aren't they? America's the same as England. We're like peas in the pod. But as you say, we can't even agree on the name for football. So what likelihood are we that we're going to not have other areas where we create misunderstanding?
That's very true. What other common mistakes or blockages have you found that can prevent executives from reaching their full potential?
It's a great question. I think one of the greatest blockages is mindset. So I've done quite a lot of work in the last 5 or 6 years with business owners that are getting ready to sell. And they might have multi-million-pound businesses, and they do. They're often between 20 and 50 million. And they want to sell because they want to get ready to retire. But it's not worth what they want it to be worth yet. And so they kind of want to retire early. So they do this hybrid where they bring in a managing director or a CEO, and they kind of go, you run it and I'm going to go over here. And the number one mistake I see them make is they bring in themselves in a different likeness. So, and the research has shown that in 85% of cases, it fails. And it fails for a really good reason. They're not the right person to take it to that next level. So one of the big things that I work on with people is that it's that mindset shift. So I was dealing with a client around this just the other day, and I said, imagine your business is like your baby, right? So you've put all your time and effort into it, and you want that baby to live on after you. That's why you've put all the time and effort into it. So imagine that your baby is now ready to go to college. Do you want it to go to Harvard, Stanford, Yale? Or do you want it to go down the road to the local college? And they're like, well, I want Harvard, Stanford, and Yale. I went, In which case you need to go and employ a Harvard, Stanford, or Yale professor. You cannot get the professor from down the road. And that's your challenge. You've built the business, you've made it your own. You are always going to be its inspiration. But what you now need to do is pass the gauntlet on to somebody that's able to take it to that next level. And you've got to be comfortable and confident that that doesn't make you less, it makes you more, because you are above the ego element and able to do the right thing for the child. And it's getting that mindset shift. And for me, that's the piece that I see and have done for the last 20 odd years, is the biggest thing that holds us back is ego. It's our biggest barrier. Our ego gets in the way of our potential. And once we can align the two and go, the only way I'm going to achieve my potential is if I admit that I might have to get somebody who's better than me to take the leap. That's the thing that unlocks it. And you can kind of talk to people and go, do you want to have 100% of a £10 million business or 50% of a £1 billion business? Which one's going to make you feel more successful? Because that's your choice. That's the kind of the difference, I think, from those people that really go on and achieve their full potential, is they were willing to admit they need other people to help them get there.
You know, ego can get in the way of so many aspects of business, of course. You know, we were talking also before the broadcast about, I call it name screening or name evaluations. And I've seen this so often that one of the mistakes that companies make is to assume that their company name, their product name, or their slogan will transfer easily into other languages in other countries. And they've got such a big ego that they don't bother to contract with a language agency just to test it. It's a wonderful, there's a huge conglomerate. It's a Mexican bakery whose trucks flow around the southern part of the United States, and they're called Grupo Bimbo. Well, a bimbo in American English is not a very positive word. So I presume in Britain as well. So, you know, how did they come up with this thinking that they could just take, and look, they're successful, so obviously it worked. And so, you know, that's fine. But that's a decision that I don't know if they even made, that they even talked about, that someone would criticize their name like that. But it's something that one should consider.
Yeah, well, because you don't know if kind of the name that you've picked up might be really offensive in another culture, because you've just not realized how it's going to translate or resonate to those areas. And I think I guess a lot of that, and I don't know, Philip, if you see this as well, is when we start a business, we don't start with the end in mind. We kind of start because we've got an idea, and then we go, we're going to build the idea, we're going to build. But we don't think about, but what if this suddenly took off internationally? What if this suddenly became a global conglomerate? Is it now going to make sense in all of those countries? We didn't think about that at the time, because we were like, you know, doing it from the side of our desk and hoping to just be able to cover our salary. And, you know, I probably my number one question I ask the businesses I work with is, what's your exit strategy? And the amount of them that come back, and I would say more than 80% that go, I don't have one. And I said, but you have to have one, because you're not immortal. So whether or not you have an exit strategy or you don't, you will exit your business.
Yes.
And you have to have it. Now that could mean you could have 4 or 5. You know, you could say, well, I want to give it to the family, I want to sell it to the staff, I want to be bought out, I want to float. Doesn't matter what it is. I said, but start with the end in mind, because what that means is all the things that you're doing as the business owner that are in here, you start to document and make to be scalable as the business goes and flows. And yet it's probably the number, I mean, the amount of my clients at the moment that I'm dealing with that are all, they're all multi-million-dollar businesses, and yet they didn't have that. And you kind of go in and go, well, yeah, how do you do this bit? Oh, well, I do this. No, but if you weren't here, oh, well, no, nobody knows how to do that. You've kind of got an issue because and somebody told me a very sad story, and it was true, about an organization. This guy built it, and it was, I think it was turning over about 35 million. And he went to sell it, and he wanted it to be worth a lot more, and it wasn't. So they didn't make the sale, and heaven forbid, but unfortunately, he had a massive heart attack and died 2 months later. And his wife went back to see whether or not she could make that sale. The business was worth nothing, because it was only worth anything with him in it,
Right.
because he documented any of those things. And I think that's the scary reality of running businesses these days, is, again, we have to acknowledge we're not immortal, and therefore make the provisions so that the business survives us, because that's what we set it up with the intention to do.
Very, very true. Do you find that these principles work in other nationalities, for example, in East Asia, where either, again, the egos may be stronger, or they're much more group cultures where the employees are to conform rather than to take the initiative, for example. In Western cultures, Western businesses, employees more or less are invited to take the initiative and to give ideas bubbling up, whereas it's quite different.
So I think certainly from the organisations I've worked with in East Asia, it's been very much about building their ability to communicate in such a way that they can raise an idea without it appearing that they've really raised it. That makes sense. So that art of being able to go, you know, we chatted the other day, you said something hugely insightful and I haven't been able to stop thinking about it ever since. And then giving them your idea. So they go, yeah, because that's a great idea. And I did say that. That's amazing. Look at me, I'm cool. So it really is in the art of how you present it. So I think a large part of success is our ability to communicate. You know, one of the biggest challenges we face is conflict. Nobody likes conflict. And when we come up with conflict in any culture, and there's a great book that I highly recommend to anybody, which is called Crucial Conversations. And it talks about the fact that in our life, moments in our life, we'll have a conversation that becomes crucial. And by that, we mean emotion becomes involved. And what happens in those cases is that we either respond with violence or silence. And what we mean by that is we get louder, we get more aggressive, we get more assertive. I always use the analogy of it's like playing Pictionary with my best friend. If I don't get it straight away, she underlines it. I'm like, no, I can see it. I just don't know what it is. So underlining it's not helping me.
You know, especially Americans abroad.
Yeah.
What do you mean you don't understand English? Can't you understand me now?
I love it. I just go a bit louder. Just yell. Or the other part is silence. So we bury our head in the sand and go, that didn't go very well. I don't want to be involved in that. But neither way addresses the issue because the issue stays there. One or more of you felt fearful of something, fearful of being found out, fearful of being sold to, fearful of being made to look. Well, it doesn't matter what the fear is, but fear. And there's a great 5-step process and it works across all cultures. And I've used this for about 15 years. The first step is you share a little bit of vulnerability. And by that, you might say something like, I feel really conflicted about bringing this up. So I'm demonstrating, I'm not out here to like attack you, feel a bit conflicted. However, I know we need to discuss this because it's currently getting in the way of whatever it's getting in the way of. So I've shared a bit of vulnerability. I've said why I'm breaking my vulnerability and I'm doing something. And then state your intention. And the most powerful intention that I've found in the last 15 years that works across any culture is I'm 100% committed to finding a solution that works for both of us. And the beauty of that one is that whatever happens next, you can come back to that and you don't have to get back up here in emotion. You stay down here in fact. So you can then say, on that basis, I'd like to share with you my initial thoughts. And when the person comes back and goes, well, that won't work for me, you go, okay. Because remember, the intention is we find a solution that works for both of us. So how do you think we could solve it? If they come up with something ludicrous, again, you can go, that wouldn't work for me, but I know our intention is that we find a solution that works for both of us. Then what you do is you agree on the things you can agree on. Because what we do when we're in conflict is we focus all our attention on the things we disagree on. But if we start to focus on all the bits we agree and say, let's work out the bits we agree first and carve them off. So the problem goes from being this big to being this big. And what we've done in doing that is we've demonstrated that we're not as misaligned as we thought we were, because we agree on quite a lot, really, don't we? So if we agree on quite a lot, there's going to be a way through this. And it allows you to kind of really deal with those different cultural challenges of not appearing to be stepping outside of the boundaries where you should really be trying to operate. It gives people a really simple framework to take you through, where you're kind of guiding people down that path without being confrontational or conflicting at any place.
Or letting people know that that's what you're doing.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I'm now on step 3. So you can all hold your horses. We'll move to step 4 next. It's more, and that's why it's more of a framework than a specific. It's just saying, like, broadly take people down this part, because you're kind of removing some of the emotion. And again, as we talked before we came on, I'm qualified to read micro expressions, and I've just been a lifelong fan of communication and learning how to hopefully be able to better understand people, because I again believe people want to be listened to, understood and respected. And when I first came across micro expressions, they identified, and they've done research on this since the 1960s, that irrelevant of our age, our race, our culture and our gender, in fact even born blind, they did tests on this with blind Olympians, that we use the same 43 muscles in our face to demonstrate the same 7 human emotions. And our emotional brain, neuroscientifically, responds 24 times faster than our thinking brain. So by the time we think, don't show the emotion, it's too late. It's already out there. And again, even born blind. So people don't have to have seen these emotions to be able to see them. It is a great skill for people to be able to learn, because what it allows you to do is just spot those. And a micro expression can last 1/25th of a second. It's fleeting, but it tells you what's really going on. You see those moments of anxiety or fear or happiness or joy or contempt, and it just gives you something to say, there's something else going on here, irrelevant of what's said next. Again, not to call it out, but to be able to ask better questions to demonstrate that understood, respected, listened to.
Fascinating. Is there anything else you'd like to add before we close?
I think for me, the number one thing that I learned in leadership, and this works across all cultures, is I think the thing that connects us all, again, irrelevant of age, race, gender, or culture, is that we teach and we learn in stories. We've been doing it since caveman drawings and the hieroglyphics. So when we're trying to get a point across, when we're trying to build a business, drive a vision, creating a compelling story, helping people to understand the part that they're expected to play, and then letting them play it. You know, I always use the analogy that if I were a film director and I've just put Helen Mirren and Brad Pitt and Pierce Brosnan in the place, I'm not going to micromanage how they bring that character to life. They've kind of pretty much earned the right to do that themselves. What I'm going to do is direct the outcome and where we get to, but I'm going to allow them to step up and do it their way. And I think when we learn to do that as leaders, when we realize that our role is to direct at that level, not to micromanage, the art of the possible is huge. And the greatest gift that I think there is in any one of us is the gift of belief. So we, every single day, every single one of us that's a leader actually gives our belief to somebody, because we ask them to do a job, and we ask them to do it because we expect them to be successful. Because if not only do they look stupid, we look stupid. So we're not going to do that unless we thought they were going to be successful. But what I'd urge people to do is take an extra minute and tell them why you believe they're going to be successful. Because on those days where they're doubting themselves, just knowing that you didn't give them a job because you just gave them a job, but you gave them a job because you believed that they were going to succeed at it because of a specific skill set or a specific thing that they'd done in the past, is going to be the thing that unlocks not only their potential, but yours.
Very true and very wise. Thank you so much. This has been a wonderful session with Kim-Adele Randall. Randall, sorry, Kim-Adele Randall. And I hope everyone will join us next week for another edition of Global Gurus and our stories of international business. Thank you.
Thanks.